Hi, Pastor Carl Johnston with the United Church of Hayworth. This is our midweek devotion for February the 11th, 2021. We're going to continue our series on searching the scriptures as a spiritual practice. Searching the scriptures. Now, last week I talked with you about being a detective and asking the questions who, what, when, where, why, how of a passage. We're still in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 31. This is the story of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Now, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is this is not the only witness that we have. Sometimes as you start to explore and start to search the scriptures, the same story can appear in a different passage. For example, this story appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the three synoptic gospels. Synoptic, like our word synonymous, they're very similar. John's gospel is very different from those three. And there are scholars who say that Matthew and Luke had the gospel of Mark and they added to it. Quite honestly, sometimes the stories are word for word. So sometimes when you're searching the scriptures, it's really helpful to see what did Matthew say about this passage, what did Luke say about this passage, and then what did Mark say about it. And then you can compare and contrast. Now, one of the things that's helpful in searching the scriptures is to know when the scriptures were written. The closer to the event is usually more historically accurate. For example, on November 22nd, 1963 was the assassination of President Kennedy. I was a boy of 5. I have my memory of that day, but if I talked to a doctor who was on staff at Parkland Hospital when they brought the president in, he would have a different perspective. He would have a different memory, different set of memories. And his would be much more close to reality than mine. So because of the difference, we look at when was the book written? How close to the event was it? And sometimes we see things that are very, very similar. And sometimes we see some things that are different. And we have to ask questions like, well, why is it written this way? And why is it written that way? So let's take a look first at Matthew's account of this passage. Matthew has an account of it, and this is in Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 and 15. Now, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. Now, one of the things you'll see in this passage in Matthew's account is that Jesus came into the house. There's no contact or no mention of him being in the synagogue first. There's nothing related to that. He comes in, she's lying sick with a fever, that's pretty common. He touched her hand. Now, in Mark's account, he lifts her up. Mark 29, Mark 30, 31. So he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. So in Matthew, he simply touches her. But in Mark, he lifts her up. He has to touch her, so there's that sense where he touches her and lifts her up. But when we look to Luke, in Luke's account, it says, now he arose from the synagogue and entered Simon's house, but Simon's wife's mother was sick with a high fever, and they made a request of him concerning her. So he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she arose and served them. So now we have Matthew saying that he touched her. In Mark, we have he lifted her up, and in Luke, we have him standing over her and rebuking the fever. The methodology of Jesus is different in all three accounts. Now, certainly to lift someone up, you have to touch them. Certainly, he had to stand up and stand over her to reach down and touch her and to lift her up. So that part goes pretty well. But rebuking the fever is a little different. So is that a conflict? Well, for some people it might be. But let's look at something more important. What's more important is after Jesus had encountered her and she had encountered Jesus, what happened? The fever left. And in Luke's account, it says it's a high fever. It's the only passage that talks about the quality of the fever, the temperature of the fever, how high it was. It could be almost, according to the scholars, a malaria kind of fever. This is part and parcel of searching the scriptures. What does Matthew say? What does Mark say? What does Luke say? Now, Mark was written between 64 and 68 AD. Matthew was written as late as 85 AD, and Luke was written between the late 60s and into the 70s. Jesus died approximately 33 AD. So there's a significant time difference. Now, let's say 33 to 63, let's say 20, 30 years. Let's say 30 years difference. February 11th, 30 years ago. What were you doing? What did you say? Who did you talk to? What do you remember from 30 years ago on February the 11th? The closer we can get to the original, the more accurate it's going to be. So, as we search the scriptures, we ask questions, we learn things, and we also have to come to some conclusions. Conclusions are that Jesus, when he encounters people, makes a big difference in their lives. And that's something for you to think about.